three more spread over the next week or 10 days. So today we have V. Geeta. Many of you know Geeta, and she doesn't really need any introduction, but let me just give you a brief background on her. So Geeta is a long-term activist in the women's movement. She's based in Chennai in Tamil Nadu. She's also an independent researcher and writer and has many, many books to her credit. She's worked on Periyar and the non-Brahmin movement. She is, in fact, going to be doing a full-length book a little later on Periyar. She has worked a lot on caste and on Ambedkar. And you remember in class last time, we talked about the 10 lectures that she'd done, which are on YouTube, which I was encouraging you to listen to. She has done a lot of work on women, and we've published one of her books on the concept of impunity. As well, you know that one of her books is Prescribed Reading for You. That's the book on patriarchy, which was published by Stree Publishers in Kolkata. And there are innumerable other pieces of Geeta's work that you'll find in different places. She's also a translator, and she has translated many people, including writers like Perumal Murugan and Revati, a transgender activist. Geeta also has been involved in setting up women's coalition groups in Tamil Nadu. And not least, I mean, I hate to use the phrase last but not least, but the one other very important thing about her is that Geeta is a publisher. She's a director at a really unusual publishing house called Tara Books, which does a lot of work on the visual and which has in many ways redefined what a book is and what a beautiful book is. Many of Tara's books are books that you want to hold and value, and they're really quite stunning. And Geeta also writes for Tara. So she does all of these things and much, much more. I don't know how she fits it all in, because I have to tell you that I can't. Being a publisher and having written only one book, I still find it difficult to fit all of that in. But Geeta manages it all. So I'm going to hand it over to Geeta. She's going to talk to you, as I said, about the women's movement and how we may look at writing a history of the past, how we may look at the present. But I'll leave it to Geeta to talk to you about that. And as she said, 40 or 45 minutes of talking, yes. And then we'll have a Q&A. You can take your break if you want. We can stop at that time, and then we can continue after you come back. So Geeta, thanks so much, and over to you.
Thanks, Urvashi, for that very generous introduction. I want to start with a confession. I'm a student of history, so almost everything under the sun I tend to approach with a historical eye. And these last few months, and perhaps even prior to that, there's much that's happening in the country that causes anguish to many of us. We are all extremely bothered and upset about what appears to be a retreat of fundamental democratic values, and particularly so with respect to women's lives, to the lives of various marginal communities, Adivasis and Dalits and workers and so on. And we've all been witness to some of these sites since lockdown began with the long march of the migrant workers, but also of innumerable crimes committed within domestic spaces because people are locked in and you can't run away from a particularly abusive situation. We've also had instances like in Tamil Nadu of young Dalit people returning home because they can't afford to live in cities anymore and having to face up to completely random violence. There was this heartbreaking story of two young men who had returned from their IT jobs in the city and got embroiled in a quarrel because they were insulted by a local dominant caste person. And when they requested them to be civil, they were beaten up and killed. So we've had a sort of ocular demonstration of the ugliness our society appears to be capable of. And of course, for us, nothing has been so vividly demonstrated as Hathras, which has been in the news for several days now. So thinking of all of these things, as a student of history, I asked myself, are we in an exceptional moment, or has this happened before? And I think for the historian, it's very comforting to know it's happened before, because then you realize that there is a way in which you can renew your understanding with respect to almost anything, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's the sort of issues faced by workers, that there is a way in which these things have happened in the past. And maybe there's a way in which we have addressed some of them critically, intelligently, and what can we learn from that, and what have we not addressed as well. So I think being a historian, therefore, is both a source of unease and comfort, because you're constantly worrying away at why is this happening again? And then you sort of sit back and say, but if it's happened once and we've addressed it, we can address it again. So I think it's a sort of an interesting position to be in, though very annoying, but that's where I'm going to start my lecture from. And I'm actually going to focus amongst many things that have been taken up and worked on by a very diverse set of groups and individuals that we call the Indian women's movements. I'm going to just focus, because we are all very fresh with it, with sexual violence, with what we've been confronted with most recently in Hathras, but which we know has sort of haunted our lives for a while now, since we are also faced with a kind of state impunity we haven't faced in the last 2 decades. Um, so, um, so the question that I posed myself, and others have also posed with regard to Hathras, is simply this: that is this exceptional? Is what transpired in Uttar Pradesh exceptional? Does it have only to do with the kind of governance that exists in that state today, or can we see it in a wider, broader perspective? So, sort of as feminists, as people who worked on sexual violence, particularly on legislation related to sexual violence, which has meant that we also then address what happens with the criminal justice system when you go to register a case and so on. I must say that we ought not to be very surprised. We've seen this happen time and again whenever we are faced with crimes of this nature. And a lot of work has gone into formulating legislation that would address it, at suggesting ways in which the functioning of the criminal justice system could be reformed. So, in a sense, I suppose this is not very new, so to speak. And specific things, for example, like the question that did the rounds in the press, that this cannot be termed sexual violence because there was no sperm that was found, which is, of course, completely ridiculous at one level, but also completely factually inappropriate, because over the years, the various amendments to the law on sexual assault have demonstrated and made it very clear that the presence or absence of semen is not necessary to prove a crime has taken place, a crime of sexual assault has taken place. And the definitions of sexual assault have been sort of expanded to include a range of violent acts, which does not have to do with penile penetration or with semen. So for me, the question was, while as feminists we are not surprised, yet the history of law, as it has sort of evolved in this country with respect to the crime of rape, why does it elude public memory? Why is it that it took a women's group to come up and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not at all necessary in the way the law looks at this crime? And that's on the one hand. The second thing is, we've also heard Dalit feminists argue that why are you also outraged? Is it so exceptional? This is what Dalit women have faced for decades. And if you think that things have altered, you're mistaken. And you really need to take a hard look at how the caste system structures people's lives and what has that done to our understanding of violence. What sort of impunity has it created at the civil level, not simply at the level of the state? So there is that. So they've also sort of pointed to a long history of structural violence. Then if you sort of speak with the civil rights people, and you will see that they will also shake their heads in dismay and tell you, but we've always told you that police reform hasn't worked in this country, that we may suggest all sorts of reform measures, but none of this becomes active at the level of the Thana, at the Tehsil. None of this really works, where much of the criminal justice system's everyday operations abide local rules of caste and class and political power and so on. So in a sense, all of us are saying we've been there before. Why have we forgotten? So what is it about the nature of history of this kind, which has dealt with crimes, especially crimes that have to do with women? How is it that each generation comes to it with a fresh sense of outrage? You know, this outrage was visible in 2013 when Nirbhaya's terrible the incident of Nirbhaya's assault and death happened, and 7 years later, again we are faced with a crime that outrages us. So the question, therefore, is what do we learn from the past, if at all anything? And for feminists and feminisms in India, and for those of us who are interested in trying to understand what women's movements have done with respect to this and other issues, what is this history and why does it elude us when we are faced with something specific, when we are faced with something particular? Shouldn't we be automatically looking back and saying, hey, that happened in 2013? In 1999, this is what we did, and why haven't we moved forward, or why can't we do the same thing again? Or we need to sort of go back and link to that past. Now, why are we able to not do that in a way that in some other context it's been possible to link to the past? So this is a question that I wish to address. And I think part of the reason for me, at least, has to do with how we write, read, and remember our histories. So how do we encounter these histories? As students, for example, you encounter them most likely in the classroom. Perhaps some of you also read widely and you may have come across such histories of the Indian women's movements in other contexts. But it is in the classroom that you are sort of presented with an opportunity and a context for a systematic understanding of women's movements, of Indian feminisms, and so on. Or if you are part of a women's group, or if you're part of a social movement, you do get to sort of experience a sense of continuity. You look for people who've thought like you've done before. You ask them to be in touch with you. You go and talk to them. So if you're part of campaigns, you inherit that history in a certain way. But in a general sense, this history is not present in our collective public imagination. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Why is that not present in our collective public imagination is an important question. And I think not just feminists in India, but feminists across the world have asked that question. Why is it that each generation has to come to this history afresh? So I think there's something that we need to sort of grapple with here. And while I may not have all the answers, I'm just going to try and suggest some ways of keeping this history alive so that it doesn't ambush us, it doesn't surprise us each time something goes wrong. And we feel more fortified, we feel more empowered to deal with whatever it is that we need to engage with, you know. So this is what it is that I wish to address today. So let me start with this campaign against sexual violence. And I don't want to do a linear history. I want to sort of sketch some suggestive trajectories that various women's groups across the country have sort of essayed in the past. And I want to start with a proposition. I remember, and I'm sure Urvashi here will remember this as well. In the 90s, when we were all struggling to work with the legal system and to refine the existing law on sexual assault, innumerable meetings, innumerable conversations, arguments, fights. And one of the things that we sort of grappled with was how do we name this crime? You know, the word rape has certain connotations. And the meaning of rape is always something that incites a kind of voyeurism. And this is largely to do with how rape is represented visually in our cinema, in our popular cultural representations, and so on. So one of the things that we grappled with and we struggled with was how do we define this crime? And Urvashi, you may recall this is very amazing phrase someone came up with. I can't recall who, but someone from Delhi, I think, that it's a crime against bodily integrity. This is something that we came up with at that time. And then since then, it became such an important way of thinking about rape because it's really not about honor. It's really not about the body being completely sort of destroyed, but it's really about how the dignity and equality and liberty that I am entitled to is completely violated by this act. So it's a crime against bodily integrity. This is one of the more interesting definitions that someone came up with in the 90s. And I think it has since got into at least feminist thinking about rape. Now, for me, what was interesting was, in retrospect, when I think back on that discussion, and also on various other histories that have grappled with sexual violence. And I'm thinking here of two or three such things that I have been reading through. One is in the 1960s, late 1960s, in Bihar. Bihar witnessed a huge famine. There was huge food hunger at that time. And it also led to a lot of political militancy, especially the rise of the armed left in Bihar at that time. And there was a local leader called Jagdish Mahato in Bihar, who was very active in building and mobilizing peasants and agricultural workers, largely from what you would call Bahujan and Dalit communities, into resisting the rapacity of landlords in different ways. And one of the things that they had sort of identified as an important issue was the complete impunity with which women were picked off the field and dragged away by landlords. And these could be women working on the fields, in their own fields, or these could be women working on other people's fields. And of course, the history of left militancy is very complex. I won't get into that. But Mahathir records saying that one of the things that we all felt extremely empowered by at that time was that after we retaliated in whatever manner, in some cases it led to the death of landlords, in some cases it led to determined resistance from workers and from small peasants. So whatever it is, when we started retaliating, it became very clear to us that our women will be safer in the fields now. So in a sense, Mahathir was also saying something about bodily integrity, but he was saying it from within a very different context. He was saying this from within the context of a social order where your life as a peasant woman or as an agricultural laborer, and the fact that you are from, say, a Bahujan caste or a Dalit caste, meant that your conditions of labor included your sexual availability. That this was not even a choice. So somewhere for those who were mobilizing around labor concerns, the fact that women could be routinely violated of their bodily integrity meant a great deal, and it became a symbol for the entire system, so to speak. And Mahathir's sort of words were very, let's say, poignant when he said, henceforth, at least our women will be safer working on the field. So this is one moment from another part of India, from another history. Bodily integrity, feminist struggles against rape, that's one kind of a history. This is another sort of a history. Now, around the same time, or perhaps a little later, and this is a book, and you have an essay by her in the reading list I've given you by Gail Omweth, who wrote an earlier book called We Shall Smash This Prison, which is based on her travels in Western India in the early 1970s, when she sort of looked at how Indian women were responding to feminisms and the world and the women's movements. She was at that time from the United States. I mean, she is from the United States, but she has made India her home and she continues to live here. So she was looking at struggles in Western India, especially in Maharashtra. And there's a very, very, very important moment in her narrative where she is talking to some women from, I think, Marathwada, which is a drought-prone region in Maharashtra. And women were migrating in droves to the cities to find work, and many of them found themselves trapped into sex work. And when Gail questioned some of the mothers whose daughters had been trafficked thus, they looked very ironically at her and they said, what do you want us to do? These green fields alone can contain our daughters. Now, what did they mean by that? It was a very cryptic statement. But basically what they meant was, we don't have land, we don't have work. Now you give us land and you ensure that that land yields something, and our women will have a different chance of survival, a survival with dignity. So only these green fields can contain our daughters. So here again, you have a sense of how this violation of bodily integrity is got to do with a system of economic exploitation and with the land question. So in Bihar, it had to do with a certain sort of structural, feudal, agrarian order. Here it had to do in the women's understanding of their situation. You give us land, and life would be very different for us. And those of you who are interested in pursuing this should read Beena Agarwal's A Field of One's Own, where she speaks of women's land rights and what that could possibly mean in to change their lives. So in any case, so the point is, if you look at these histories, you see that people come to an understanding of how women's bodily integrity can be violated, can be compromised. So while feminists and women's movements understood this in terms of how you completely forfeit any sort of control over your body when you're dragged away, when you're hurt, when you're completely sort of incarcerated by this violence. Now, the act of violence is something that we focused on, the phenomenological experience of violence. And I think it was very important we did that, because just by calling it rape, it doesn't really necessarily lead you to understand it in the way that women experience it. So, in that sense, to name it as a crime against bodily integrity was important. But bodily integrity doesn't only have to do with sexual vulnerability, it has to do with not having land. It has to do with being part of a social economic system where the Bahujan and Dalit communities are tied in relationships of bondage and exploitation within an agrarian system. So, this is one set of observations. Now, let me switch to another part of India, Nagaland. Now, Nagaland is again back in the news, as some of you know, with the talks about the Naga autonomy. Now, interestingly, in Nagaland, for a long time, there's been a refusal among certain sections of the population to be part of the Indian nation state. They believe in what they call independent Nagaland, and they've been fighting for it in different ways. Now, the government of India has been resolutely against this demand and has uh, consistently from the 1950s deployed its military and paramilitary to contain whatever challenges have emerged in Nagaland. Now, as often happens when the military is found in large numbers in any part of the world, not just India, the way it violates your everyday life, the way people can come into your houses and do a search, the ways in which you can be dragged off, and particularly the ways in which women stand to be shamed, humiliated, and sexually hurt. Now, this is something we've seen time and again in places like Kashmir. We've seen it in Manipur. We've seen it in Nagaland. Some of you might have read of this terrible protest. I say terrible because not just the shock value of it, but the poignancy of it. When elderly Naga women stripped themselves naked and stood outside an army camp and said, "Indian army, rape us." You might remember this from some years ago, because they were trying to sort of seek justice for sexual violence committed by members of the armed forces. So when you have that kind of a situation, and you do find crimes uh, continue to take place, but more to the point, it's hard to talk about them, because anything you say can be construed as a position you take against the Indian state's actions in that region. So you could be accused of sedition. You could be accused of putting the Indian state's security and sovereignty at risk. So it's been very difficult to talk about it, but women have spoken. And in 1971, a group of women belonging to a women's group in Nagaland, attached to the Baptist Church, actually wrote a letter to Premier Indira Gandhi, saying that the depredations that we face beggar words. They are calculated to humiliate us. Many of these terrible acts take place within churches. And you can see why they say that. Nagaland is largely Christian. And to deliberately choose a place of worship valued by the community and to commit heinous crimes there is a sort of double insult, a double humiliation. So there they sort of speak of bodily violation in terms of a larger practice of humiliation and violation of their sense of who they are, of their sense of being Christian, and of course, being women. So you have a different sort of coming to terms with bodily, the crime against bodily integrity in Nagaland. So, and that's something that you can also then sort of use to read what happens in places like Kashmir. You can use that to read what has happened in places like Chhattisgarh, for example, where constantly you have the routinization of these kinds of acts in the name of security, sovereignty, development, the nation state, and so on. So, on the one hand, There are acts of sexual violence which emerge and which are routinized because they are part of a socio-economic agrarian order. And they have to do with the fact that those who labor don't have lands of their own, that they can't actually expect to live with dignity. And they are therefore pushed into different levels of sexual vulnerability. You also have situations where the violation is not simply of the woman's body, but of what that body is linked to, whether it's a resistant community, whether it's a resistant politics from that region. And this has happened time and again in different parts of India. So now I just want to sort of ask you to also, if some of you have had time to go through the readings I sent you. So now, if rape is a crime which is against women's bodily integrity, then we need to necessarily keep in mind that bodily integrity is not simply what happens to the female body. It is certainly that, and we must sort of not take away from how women experience that violence and how they fight it and how they stay with stay with themselves and endure and resist. That's very important. But at the same time, it is not simply something that is defined by that individual body alone. It has to do with also how that body acquires certain meanings in particular settings and how those things cannot be understood outside of their context. And if you think, go back to the set of readings I've sent you, there's one very short piece from Manushi, the feminist journal that was started in 1979, which is basically readers have written in about the various sorts of sexual violence that have taken place across the country. This is 1983, if I'm not mistaken. And they are sort of saying how they have all tried to do something about it. And you will notice that just at the moment when the women's movements across India were talking about sexual violence, Manushi provides a platform for all of us to come together. But you also see that people are coming to it from such different struggles. There is a civil rights struggle in the Punjab. There's a struggle to do with Adivasi rights in Madhya Pradesh. There's something to do with working women in another part of India. So you see that the whole struggle around sexual violence cannot therefore be understood only in terms of the act. Now, let's switch back to Hathras. The problem that we've all faced with Hathras is that the only way we seem to have of decoding it is either in terms of what has happened to that particular individual or that particular individual in a particular defined social setting in Uttar Pradesh. That she belongs to a particular Dalit community, it's a minority community in that village, it is known for its casteism, it has a government steeped in impunity. So this is how we read that whole situation. This is not wrong. Certainly, it's not wrong. And Dalit women are certainly completely on the mark when they say this is not exceptional. But I think we may also want to step back a bit and look at these various ways in which people who have tried to come to terms with this sort of crime, with this sort of violence, have sought to process it. And they have processed it through particular histories of resistance, to particular histories of struggle. And none of these can be comprehended outside of their specific geographies. So, for instance, you cannot really understand have a sense of Punjab's agrarian history. And you won't be able to sort of make sense of what happened in 1969 if you didn't have a sense of the famine. Neither would you be able to make sense of how people mobilized around issues in Punjab if you didn't have a sense of how Naxalbari traveled from Bengal to Bihar. So there's a very complicated regional story here. And these stories are very germane to our understanding of any of the issues that we wish to sort of unpack in a feminist sense. Do we do that all the time is the question. Um, it is not always possible to sort of sit back and work through all of these things at the time when you have to act. So it doesn't really help to look at Hathras and say, well, it happened in Bihar, it happened in Nagaland, it happened in Tamil Nadu. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if we as students, as those that wish to sort of build long-term knowledge systems and long-term strategies against crimes such as this, we may want to first of all define for ourselves the problem in as layered and rich a manner as possible. So it seems to me that one way to do it is to think of how, as feminists, we may join the dots in our understanding so that if we are doing a study of sexual violence, we not only just say, oh, but this is what the women's movement did. There was the case in Mathura. So there was a case of Mathura. There was a case of Ramizabi. There was Bhavani Devi. And then we go on to what we did with the law and how we protested, how we refined the law, the struggles we faced. So we build a certain narrative. But perhaps if we sort of didn't just do that, but then we asked ourselves, who is Mathura? Where is she from? She's an Adivasi girl. So what was the Adivasi situation in Madhya Pradesh at that time? Why did this happen? Or if you look at Ramizabi, Ramizabi is from Hyderabad. Now, what is the situation of Muslims in Hyderabad? Are they class divided? How do you understand Muslim lives? So if you sort of zero in on these particular geographies, then you come up with an understanding that will learn not only from the experiences of women who want to understand these things, and we are invested in knowing and acting against all of this. So we want to understand it. We of course look back at our own lives, very important, because gender is ultimately a lived reality. We can't run away from our bodies, right? So of course it's very important to say that could have happened to me, or this is something that I've heard of in my family, or that I didn't ever want to face it, but it did happen to me once. There are ways in which we all come to terms with it through the experiential lens. But how do we connect this experiential lens to various ways of thinking about that particular experience? And here is where I'd like to sort of say geographies of resistance and understanding become very important. So we don't start with this idea that there is something called the Indian feminist movement's understanding. Of course, there is one. It's not that it doesn't exist. It is there in how we present a point of view and how we argue, the kinds of positions we take. But behind those positions, behind those arguments, there is a deeper, longer history. And we've all come to this position out of those histories. So if I am part of a conversation on refining the rape law, I come from a particular history of thinking about women's lives, about sexual violence, about caste, about class from within my location in Tamil Nadu. And if say Urvashi comes to it, she comes from having lived in Delhi, having worked on partition, having been part of struggles in the capital. So that is another way of making sense of this. Now, the point is, when we write our histories, we assume that all of these meet at one point, and that's the history we need to present to the world. That's not incorrect. Of course, that's not incorrect. But then these various ways of coming to that one point thereby get elided. They become the backstory, so to speak. So how do we sort of have no backstories but retain everything as front stories so that we learn from that all the time? And when something happens, we learn to carry this or that aspect of these various front backstories forward. So let me give you two examples before I finish with this thing. One is, of course, how do we do this? In practice, what does it mean? It's all very well to say this in theory. So in order to understand how we may enrich our understanding of how feminists have arrived at a certain position, let's say sexual assault, I'm going to go back to the Nirbhaya story now because it's a more recent event. And some of you know that after the Nirbhaya episode happened, the Justice Verma committee was set up to inquire into how the law against sexual assault may be further amended and changed and so on, which led to the amendment that was passed in 2013. Now, in the lead up to that, women's groups got into a huddle and we discussed what is it that we would like to tell this committee. Of course, on the one hand, we've done an enormous amount of legal thinking. We also have a lot of case laws that we can bring to the table. But what else can we do? And I think one of the things that proved to be important for us was what can we learn from other struggles? And I remember that some of us who've been very involved in looking at the Prevention of Atrocities Act against Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes 1989 in Tamil Nadu, we said that there's a lot to be learned from that campaign and that history. How has this law come to be? How did its contents get made? How does it work in practice? What may we learn from the larger ideological arguments which accompany the transactions around that law? Which means that what can we learn from these anti-caste movements? So Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh especially have had a long history of engaging with this law more than other states, including actually, interestingly, Maharashtra, where you would have expected a greater engagement with the law. But actually, Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh have done a lot of work around jurisprudence. So in that sense, some of us sort of suggested that this should be one context from which we rethink whatever we need to think about the rape law. And I think that was important because it also pointed to the fact that we stand to enrich an understanding from how some of us have benefited in our own context. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, struggles against the Atrocities Act has never only been a Dalit issue. It has always sort of brought into a kind of a comradeship various kinds of political and socially active groups, Dalit groups, women's groups, civil rights groups, Dravidian parties, and various other sundry players. Now, this partially has to do with the fact caste is in your face in Tamil Nadu. You can't run away from it in any manner. And secondly, it's one of the few states where, from the very beginning, the women's movement has been largely Bahujan. There have been tensions between Bahujans and Dalits, but the Savarna component has always been in the sort of in let's say, recession, so to speak. So I think it has made for a certain understanding of the women's question. It's very specific to Tamil Nadu's politics, Tamil Nadu's history of thinking and organizing around caste and so on. And I think learning from that history is very, very important. And that history is very specific. And the reading I have put in your pack, Fatima Bernard's story of her own organization, will tell you how specific that is, because that's a history that's not narrated in any history of the Indian women's movements. It is not a history that emerged out of women feeling uneasy with the left, or women being politicized during the emergency, or women sort of coming to terms with their situation because of their struggle with the Indian armed forces. Rather, it's a struggle that's emerged out of Christian social work, out of these groups that have been um, part of what you call social work education. So, and Fatima actually mentions that in her essay. I mean, she came out of a Christian group. And the influences that fed into that kind of a situation were very myriad. They had a lot to do with liberation theology, for example, with Paulo Freire, with Saul Alinsky, with models that we are not usually familiar with. And that sort of shaped their activism. And you will also notice it's not so much legal concerns that she's forefronting. She's talking about how do you mobilize locally, how do you deal with local situations, how do you work with the local police. Um, and also you'll notice that their women's group takes up a range of other issues to do with land, to do with employment. So in a way, you realize that the question of sexual assault cannot be sort of taken to be the act that is foregrounded, but the larger context, something which I've been saying, but which has been the way that women's groups in some parts of the country have worked with this whole problem. And Fatima's story is one sort of a example of how that was done. Now, the second thing is I want to sort of say, when you look at these regional stories, so to speak, these regional histories, I hate the word region. I'm just using it because I can't find a better word. Just explains that if you were to think of a national response, that's not very useful. One has to think of a more interconnected response, let's say, a response that connects each of us in ways that are not mediated only by the fact that we have to present a national position. The national position emerges in all its richness, it's one thing, but we don't have to speak in a unified voice. But that doesn't mean we're going to speak in an inchoate, completely relativistic mode either. Because if you look at Fatima's own life, it's very interesting because she is a Dalit woman from the region that she continues to work to this day. But she had a university education. She had a theological education in the United States. She's very linked to the national women's movement, the Dalit women's movement, and to feminist networks in the Asia Pacific region. So to be working in the local doesn't mean that you shut yourself off. What it means is that we need to establish in every instance what are these influences that push us to act? What gives us the strength to act, the clarity to act? And how do we tell these stories so that we understand that we may arrive at a certain position together, but each of us comes from a particular sort of struggle, a particular way of dealing with that struggle. So, and I think those things are not variations on the same theme, right? It's not that. I'm not saying let's be pluralistic. I'm saying that we need to keep in mind that specific modes of understanding will actually help us refine our strategies in very rich ways. So, and which is what we did with respect to the Justice Verma Committee's recommendations. They turned out to be very extensive, very deep, because we finally realized that we cannot work just with the law as the women's movement has sought to engage with in certain contexts. We need to look beyond that context. And I think we do that every time we are faced with a crisis. We did that in Gujarat 2002, which saw huge violence against minority women. And then we realized that that sort of rape, those crimes that we were witness to, are completely sort of not articulable within the terms of the law as it existed. How do you explain some of the more dastardly crimes that unfolded in Gujarat? And we all, it beggared words, it beggared understanding. So we realized that, and you cannot think about rape in terms of just the law alone. You have to think about it in terms of what is happening in this country, what's happening in Gujarat, what are the forces that were mobilized, what does the politics of nation building have to do with it, you know? So the story of Gujarat became very central to how we even rethought sexual violence. So at that moment in crisis, we learned a certain lesson. And with Nirbhaya, we learned another lesson, that how do you sort of then come to this history, you know? So, and I think these are very, very important things. And what it then demands of us as feminists, this sort of understanding of history, of thinking of the women's movement in an interconnected sense, so that we sort of realize that, yes, we may all face sexual assault. And I think it's a kind of a vulnerability that unites all of us, women, people of other genders, people of other sexes, because all of us are viewed as simply being wrong. Right? We're all wrong. um, Women are not right at all, and everybody else who wants to opt out of being heterosexual or out of the heteronormative framework are also not right. And if women have to be right, they have to be right in a certain way, which is not how many of us are. So I think there's a certain rhetoric of wrongness that unites all of us. In that sense, we are all equally vulnerable. But that doesn't mean that we are trying to say that all our fates are similar. They're not similar. But there is a way in which we need to sort of hold a mirror to each other, so we see exactly where is it that we are vulnerable, where is it that some of us can step back and think a little more and work a little more on ourselves, where is it that we may listen to other people and retreat and let them show us the way. And I think these things can only happen if we have a rich sense of our own histories. So with Hathras, if we have a sense of the history of fighting sexual assault as one that draws from different sources, right? It draws from what the women's movements have done. It draws from the left struggle in Bihar. It draws from Dalit women's struggles in Maharashtra, from the Naga women's struggle, from the Manipur protests. And then you have a sense that, yes, we are talking about vulnerability, violation, bodily integrity. But in each case, we are being shown a politics which we have to engage with. It is the politics of fighting the, the exploitative agrarian order, the politics of anti-caste and class resistance, the politics of challenging the hegemonic aspirations of the Indian nation state. So feminists have to have a position on all this, whatever positions we take. I cannot simply say that I'm only concerned about this act of bodily violation. Yes, of course, I'm concerned. But then I'm also concerned because it feeds into a range of extremely unsavory politics in this country. And I need to have a position on all of that. And how do I work myself into that understanding? Only if I see my own history as connected to all of that. And that's the point I sort of wanted to communicate in this thing. I'll just make two observations and end my talk. One is that if you look at the readings I've sent you, I've tried to sort of choose readings which show you these interconnections, and that if they appear unified, the arguments that feminists make, they're unified only in retrospect. You write history after the fact is in place, right? When you write about something while it's taking place, that's not history. That's a record, that's journalism, you're bearing witness. But you step back 5 years later, 10 years later, and you say, hey, this is what we did then. So all these things that you have been asked to read are really attempts at coming to terms with what was happening at that moment and trying to write about it. And they're all tentative. None of those accounts are final. If you remember, if you go through them, you'll realize they're all trying to make sense of what is happening. And I think that tentativeness is what politics is all about. And when we recall those times, we need to both recall how we made sense later on, but also how we were tentative. We were trying to formulate something. So, and I think if you keep both of these in mind, then you get a sense of how things are fairly open in terms of how you understand anything. That you don't have to think that this is the feminist position. Yes, at certain points in time, this was the feminist position, but we arrived at it through different routes, and we were ourselves tentative about it at some point. So with that, that is a very humbling sort of thing. So you don't feel like then saying that, oh my God, this we have done everything wrong, we've never done anything right, or we've done everything and why is this happening? You don't get into any of those positions. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is something I want us to think about, and you perhaps are in a better position as younger people to think about it than me, because I'm not engaged with that world in any systematic sense, is what is happening to communication and politics today. And of course, let's forget the exceptional circumstances of the lockdown. That's made things, far more complicated. But today, much of political debate happens on social media, which I think is a very interesting and important development because it has connected people who otherwise wouldn't be able to connect across the world, across geographies, across languages. Um, but at the same time, it has also done something to our sense of time. So we feel the need to respond. We feel the need to immediately take a stance. And since so much of it is tied to our sense of who we are and how we present ourselves to others, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or whatever, we also feel we must say something, be someplace, do something. And that can be exciting. It can lead to some very unexpected happy developments. But at the same time, what does it do to time? This is something we need to think of. What are we reacting to? Often, as you know, perhaps as users of this media, you are reacting to what is before you. And what is before you may not even be the original message. It's what somebody has liked 500 times over or disliked 800 times over. So each time you're responding, you're already moving away from something and you're caught in this bind of expression and counter expression, right? And this is something that's being sort of refined to a political model today, both by regressive politicians as well as progressive politicians. And, what is happening? Is the medium becoming the message in a way that we're not even noticing? It's important because what this does to time is it makes you imagine, because of the urgency of response, because of the alacrity with which we respond, that we are doing something very important and that we are taking positions, we are calling people out, we are saying stuff. But what it is that we are being robbed of is our situatedness in history, that we are products of continuities and discontinuities. We cannot ever be understood only in terms of that one moment that we inhabit. And if we do that, we're all willingly consenting to amnesia. We're all willingly consenting to being dememorized in some ways. And once you do that, almost anything can be said about the past. They may not be entirely untrue, but they will become shorthands, convenient ways of referring to things, which really don't capture the richness, the problems, the complexities of how all of us live, right? And how our forefathers and foremothers and foreothers lived. It would be spectacularly unfair to people who've gone there before us and because of whom we are here today. So I think that's something important. This is not to say that the past should be memorialized or the past is right. None of that. All I'm saying is to recap this lecture in 3 short sentences that our sense of the past need not be defined only by the way a certain problem has come to be defined in the present, even if it is a feminist way of defining it. That this can be understood as a point of arrival to which we came from different directions. It's very useful to know all those directions so that we understand any particular event in all its complexity. And secondly, when we do that, we stand to learn from different contexts and we are not bound by this one particular event and one way of seeing and thinking. And we also see that in retrospect, we may have simplified our own experiences. When those experiences were taking place, they were nowhere near that simple. We simplify it and then we pass it off as knowledge. And then we stand to completely sort of put it on a complete planar level today with social media, where there's no complexity, there's no richness. It doesn't have to be that way because social media is full of possibilities. It's the fairy land of hypertext, right? You can connect in so many different ways. You can create things on the web which can answer to this richness. It's a technology that can be utopian. But if we bring to it models of thinking and acting, which only build this sense of narcissistic politics, then I think we may all be sadly two-dimensional, and our imagination will suffer such a retreat that we will be caught in this terrible loop of liking, disliking, trolling, anti-trolling, which is not which is not where we should be, I think. So I'll stop with that, and we'll take questions. If you want a break, I'm happy to for you to go and have a cup of tea, but whatever you decide.
Thank you so much, Geeta, for that wonderful session and for really, giving us the framework in which to think of many questions that the students have been grappling with, and also pointing to this, the such important interconnections and the the different strands that go into the making of those interconnections and creating the geographies of feminist movements. So many thanks. I'm sure the students have found it very useful. Do you guys want to take a break, or do you want to go? Or what you could do is, those of you who want a break, you could just go off. Or what do you think, Sanchit, Rashi? What do you think? What are you getting from the students?
If you want a break, just put the thumbs up option. So based on the
Okay.
comment.
Break walas, put the thumbs up option. No, I'm not. Are we seeing a lot of them? No, Geeta, it's quite clear that they don't want a break.
Wow. Then let's talk.
So, okay. So then let's get into questions. Have you got any questions, or would anyone like to step in and ask questions?
You can start raising your hands.
There's nothing in chat box yet, from what I see.
May I go first?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Hi, Geeta ma'am. So,
yeah, hi.
Thanks for this great lecture.
Can you speak up? Your voice is falling.
Parmesan, little
Am
loud.
I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is like little bit general in the sense. So our course title, maybe you aware with that, kids include the changing India. So I just want to know like your interpretation in the like you are a history student, so you are well aware with the history of women. So I just want to ask you, how will you interpret the situation of women like specifically in India and at the world level with the aspect of changing things?
It's a very large question. I won't be able to do justice to it. I'll very briefly sort of perhaps point out a couple of things. One thing is that we have a range of women's voices today in the public sphere. We have women from very diverse backgrounds talking about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be studying, what it means to be working, what are the kinds of issues and concerns that women confront. So there's no one story about what are women's problems. So people come to public debates from very different locations, and that is evident in classrooms, that is evident on television debates, or in any other public context. And I think this is something very important, and this is a fairly historical development as far as India is concerned, because a number of these voices are from contexts and communities which have never really been allowed to be part of the public sphere until recently. And I think while they've always been assertive, while they've always sort of created their own cultures of protest and resistance, mainstream society has very carefully kept them away and said, okay, you do your stuff, but don't come and tell us what to do. But today, I think there's a way in which, while politically democracy is in crisis, socially, I think the democratic world has got very enlarged. We listen to a lot of different voices, a lot of different opinions from different women, from people from different contexts, not just in India, but in the world. Now, what has changed? That is, of course, one major change. But along with that, when you have a diversity of voices, when you have different opinions being put forth, and things that we take for granted are being challenged, Of course, there's going to be conflict also. There's going to be retaliation, there's going to be anger. And so you also see that the women's question is being greeted with a new hostility today. You know, there's a lot of very unpleasant stuff being said about women from everybody, from these fake Swamijis to judges to people in parliament to actors to all kinds of people are saying all sorts of things. So there's a sort of new kind of attack on women's liberties, on women's equality. Indeed, against anybody who doesn't identify with the normative gender also. So I think all of these are things that we are seeing simultaneously. Very much in the present over the last 10 years, we're also seeing the danger, I don't think it's happened yet, danger of having some victories being reversed. Not victories so much, certain modest positive developments being reversed, especially to do with caste and religion. I think till the last, I think following 9/11, there's been a worldwide sort of resurgence of Muslim women's activism. Across the world, Muslim women have been mobilizing, acting, thinking, coming to terms with feminism, talking about what does it mean to be a woman, a Muslim, and a feminist. Now, a very rich debates emerged in India as well. Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, the Tamil Nadu Muslim Women's Jamaat, all kinds of groups across India, very active in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now that, and we found a sort of very rich fusion of that in Shine Bagh and in various other sites in last year and early this year. Now that is something that is sort of being, that's facing a crisis today. And that is a very sad development because I think it has yielded one of the most richest understandings of feminisms for many of us. At least personally, I've learned a lot from my Muslim women friends. That's one thing. The second thing is the assertion of Dalit intellectuals across India. And I think they have set new standards in intellectual inquiry. They've also pointed to traditions of learning and thinking that have never been counted amongst worthwhile traditions. And that has affected the way we think about women's lives. And I think that is also sort of being threatened, not so much directly as has happened with Muslim women's lives, but through this policy of what is being done to education and also what is being done to anybody who expresses an independent opinion. You know, there's a general intolerance that's setting in. And I wouldn't be surprised if people that are venerated as leaders are also soon termed enemies of the nation. So this is something that we need to sort of keep in mind. It's a very frightening development, but this is not particular to India. We see it happening elsewhere in the world also. In Turkey, you see it happening. Indonesia, you see it happening. Philippines, Japan, everywhere. But I think in the Indian context for women, something that's opened up for many of us to learn from, to think about, is also the sources of that are in crisis. And I think that's something that's worrying, much as so much has happened to make us feel that, you know, things are interesting. So.
Devashri?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for the lecture. I had, I think, one or perhaps a related question to that. So it's about the first point that you had raised, that that there have been cases of violence against sexual violence against women in the past as well. But it's an extrapolation of what you'd said, that there is, whenever something of this sort happens, there's always outrage. Is it because the memory of those incidents is suppressed, or is it because certain expectations are not being fulfilled? Why is it that Nirbhaya caused that sort of reaction to come about? Now the Hathras case has caused that to come about. Is it because the mainstream keeps suppressing those incidents? Or
yes, it's a very good question. It's not very, I don't know if there's a very straightforward answer to that one, but I think maybe not a suppression of memory so much, but that we continue to see sexual violence as that one exceptional act. You know, whereas if we saw it in a far more structural and social sense, there would be a way in which we continue to have conversations around all that makes sexual violence possible. Whether it's caste, whether it's the land question, whether it's the nationality question, so that we don't come to a particular issue only because it's an incident, it's an event, and so on. So I think challenge is, how do we react to any particular instance? Because every instance is also new. It's not that one can say it's happened before, therefore I'm not surprised. Of course not. Hatras must shock us. If it doesn't shock us, we've ceased to be human. But then not shock us in the sense of, how can, as you put it, is it because we have certain expectations? Maybe that's part of it, that we think there are laws, that, you know, we've been talking about it for so long. How can this happen again? That's of course there. That kind of an outrage is completely rational and understandable. But I think the outrage also comes from the fact that we always talk about these things in the singular. And how do we not do that? How do we keep these connections going? Maybe it can't be done about through talking about sexual assault alone. It has to be done through ongoing conversations around inequality, around the way we negotiate sexual relationships, the way we understand state impunity, you know. So I think those are the conversations that should be part of our civic life in a tempered sense. So we learn and we think along, rather than sort of just respond. But having said all of this, one thing that you also realize when you listen to feminist conversations elsewhere in the world is something particular about the nature of memory to do with feminist politics. That feminist politics has been the hardest to sustain in a collective sense in public memory. And I think that has to do with the refusal of people who are engaged in politics, whether of the right or the left or anything in between, to take the claims of feminism as political thought, political action seriously. And I say this after not out of rancor or anger, but a sheer mundane fact. There's been such phenomenal research by women in several spheres, history, geography, the social sciences, but how much of it actually gets fed into your educational system? You will have a course that is on feminism, but does feminism inform everything you study? As it should. It doesn't. So you can have a class on democracy without having to engage with the feminist perspective on democracy. So that's the other problem, that it has never been allowed to become part of any kind of collective knowledge. And I think there's some very assiduous gatekeeping going on there. And many of us have persisted in doing what we do in spite of the gatekeeping. But that's, or even as publishers, like when Urvashi and Ritu Menon started Kali for Women, no one even knew what feminist publishing was all about. But then the moment that became a concept, publishing houses that have not taken women's writing seriously suddenly had women's lists. But that doesn't mean that everything else they publish, they put through a feminist measure. They don't. Whereas we continue to do. And we also continue to flagellate ourselves about going wrong on other things. So I think that politics, reflexive politics of feminism has never been part of, and will never be allowed to be part of public memory, because too much it is at stake for patriarchal authority. It'll be a struggle. We'll continue to struggle.
Thank you.
Navya?
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
Professor, while I understand the point that the various struggles of different kinds of women from different geographies are coming more into the mainstream now and are taken into consideration by all kinds of people across the country. But is kind of listening enough? I mean it in the sense that more and more people, especially women, are coming up with their struggles and addressing them and talking about them, and more people are listening as well. But is that transaction of just speaking and just listening enough? Does that kind of address the gap? And what seems to be the solution for this is my first question. And the second question is, sorry. The second question is whether, that's fine.
Are you sure? Well, I answer, you can think about what you wish to ask. I don't know, are we listening is my question. We may have different ways of looking at some things. And in fact, I think the point I was trying to make was we actually don't have that many different stories. We have certain kinds of stories. But your point is, I suppose, even if there were all these points of view, that is it enough to just listen and heed? Um, I think there are two issues at stake. One is that listening is a very cultivated emotion. It doesn't come about naturally. Because to listen to things requires patience, humility, and always the risk that we could be completely wrong, and that whatever we listen is going to sort of pull the rug from under our feet. So many of us resist listening. And one of the things that feminisms and feminist movements have set great store by is listening. All the women's groups that emerged in the 1970s were all open spaces where people could come and talk and be heard and be heeded. Now, that is something that even feminists have stopped doing in the measure that they did in the past. And I think that's a very sad loss. Sigmund Freud, actually said listening is a kind of a great epistemological significance. Listening is a form of learning. Because he himself was a psychoanalyst, he listened to lots of people, right? So listening, I think, hasn't happened at all, and it's a kind of a cultivated politics which we need to sort of build on carefully, and that only happens if we are open to listening to what we don't wish to hear, in the knowledge that it doesn't matter if we are wrong, and we are human, we are imperfect, we could be wrong. Most of the times we are. So in that sense, I think listening hasn't happened, in fact, not to the extent that would make a difference. If that happens in a serious manner, that we actually listen, we would not stop with listening. We would actually act, you know. So, and I think that sort of that listening thing is a very, very important thing. And we need to think about that a lot more. What impedes us from listening? What is it we don't wish to hear? What are the defense mechanisms we create so that we don't want to hear? But equally, how do we talk so that we are heard? There's a very interesting book by the sociologist Suryakant Wagmore, who teaches in IIT Bombay, and his book is interestingly titled "Civility Against Caste." He says a caste system is so barbaric that the only way you can confront it is by being civil, civility. And likewise, I think speech also requires to be civil. It has to be patient. I mean, there's anger, you can hate things, it's not about how you communicate something, but civility is allowing that there's another point of view, that however badly hurt you are as a woman, you will listen to somebody who says, maybe you're wrong, maybe this is because of that. I don't mean we should listen to hate speech, we should listen to baseless things. But if there are people who are equally invested in the issue, but who come to it from another position, I think civil listening is important. Civil speaking is also important. These are very, very important things. And that happens, then I think the future of these transactions could be very different.
Ma'am, as per your point about listening, which makes a difference, is there also not an element of listening with the right ears, or listening which reaches the right ears, who are able to make a kind of a difference? And the second thing that I wanted to come into was what kind of future are we looking forward to as feminists? Would that entail more and more voices coming up and more active listening? Or is that also about other things more than that?
Good questions these are. And I need to reflect on them a little more to give you any meaningful answer. But for now, I'll say that yes, it's not enough to listen. It's also whose ears are you reaching? Certainly, that's important. But perhaps if we are thinking of building a culture of mindful listening, we may also not always want to address those whose ears matter. There is that also. You may not reach government, you may not reach those that can make new laws, but you may actually end up persuading the entire community to think differently. There's that also. So I think there's a lot to be said for the quality of listening and speaking, which will make us our views available to people that may not be able to act decisively, but who might transform their lives, therefore. And that's, I think, something that feminist groups have understood through their own practice. And if you listen to a woman and you heed her, and there's a way in which she feels that she's in charge of her life has changed. It may not change in a substantive sense a day after tomorrow, but she's never going to go back to being what she was. And that's also why people don't want to listen to women. In a serious legal sense, the problem with Hathras is that there was a dying declaration, but nobody's listening to it. Nobody's listening because too much is at stake if you actually listen. So listening is in that sense important. And in the future of feminism, more and more voices certainly, and more and more listening certainly, but also I think ways of living with difference and disagreement. We will disagree, we can't all think the same. But what is a civil way to disagree? How do we sort of get along? How do we all take responsibility for power, entitlement, and privilege without feeling paralyzed? There's that also that's important. And how do we not make everything something that has to do with us? It doesn't have to do with us. It has to do with the world also. So I have done this. How dare you ask me this? That's a very illegitimate question. I have behaved well, but why are you making me responsible for what the world is doing? But your behavior is immaterial in the sense that so many people like you don't behave that way. So these are some of the ways in which we may want to also think about the future of feminism. I think one of the things is that feminisms will continue to flourish as long as there are thinking women, as long as there are thinking gendered selves that are not happy with the normative as it's defined. And we will push those limits and boundaries. And ultimately, more than any other ism, it has to work in real life. No? I mean, it's not like something that you can go protest at a meeting outside and you don't have to be a socialist at home. You can underpay your workers. No one's going to hold you up. But if you are not a feminist at home, you can't live with yourself. So I think in that sense, it has a future that is not so easy to take away from us.
There's an anonymous question which Rashi will read out.
Yeah.
Is there such a gradation of issues within the feminist movement? Is there a relatively more important issue and a relatively less important issue within feminists? Context: a common whataboutism against the feminist movement, especially social media, where the conversation is largely dominated by urban middle class, is this idea that there are bigger issues. We saw this most evidently during Me Too movement, specifically as it related to workplace harassment, where some detractors were emphasizing sexual violence against rural women.
Well, priorities are what we set, no? I mean, as I said, and this has to go back to our understanding of social media also. It does define the nature of politics in a certain way. Now, who is to say what is more important and what is less important is the question, and what other issues should be discussed and what is at stake for all of us. I think the Me Too movement threw certain things into relief. That those who, in Tamil, we have a saying, it's only the crying child that gets milk, right? So, in that sense, that you have to sort of be in a position to say something, and the previous question, and be heard in the right quarters for something to become effective. So when the list was published, and it was published on social media, and it acquired a certain kind of traction, it sort of opened up an entire area of discussion. And people who haven't been able to say some stuff came out and said it. Now, does it define the range of issues we should be discussing? Certainly does not. But at the same time, it did spur into existence a new set of conversations around harassment. They may not be representative. They certainly did not represent the more structured nature of sexual harassment, of the kind that I sort of pointed to, like what happened in the fields of Bihar. That also qualifies as harassment at work, but it's of such a violent nature that it can't be sort of understood in this sense. But basically, it opened up certain conversations. It spurred us to think of things anew. It certainly doesn't represent more than what it was. But there's no reason, therefore, to say it's not important. I think it's as important as the people that take it up and act with it and stay with it and go on with it and fight those cases in court or wherever or whatever. And if there are other things that are more important, then those of us who think they are more important are perfectly free to go and pursue them. So I don't really want to get drawn into thinking through greater and lesser issues. It's like saying greater and lesser suffering. That is not, that sort of a hierarchy I feel very uneasy with. I think each of us chooses our area of struggle and work, and we do what we can with the capacities we have where we are. And if some struggles are larger, greater, bigger, and there are energies on the street, then I hope we are all sensible enough and humble enough to join our struggles with those larger struggles and be part of those, and not say that only this is important to me. That's all one can hope for.
Nehal?
Hi, Professor. First of all, thank you for the lecture. I have,
Louder, please. Louder, please.
hello, can you hear me? Is that
Yeah,
better?
yeah.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you for the lecture. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to listen to you. I attended your entire lecture series on Ambedkar.
Oops.
So yeah, this was really exciting. So yeah, I basically have two questions. So the first question is that when all of these instances of sexual violence take place, a lot of debate is stirred around changing the legislation. And it's not largely centered around bringing about greater structural changes in the society. That's where the greater debate around whether, rapists should be put through capital punishment or not. So my question is that one, that do you think that this greater centrism around legislation sort of prevents us from bringing about long-term institutional changes in the society in terms of gender paradigm? I have another question, so should I put it right now? Should I?
Let me answer this one.
Yeah, okay.
See, the law is a strange beast. You need it, but it's not ever sufficient. And since you attended my Ambedkar classes, I'll give you an Ambedkarite response to that. One is that, as you know, he was very invested in the legal system. He was a lawyer, practiced law, and of course, worked in the Constituent Assembly. And he did believe that the rule of law was an extremely significant historical development in the Indian context, where you had religious scripture determining what your life was to be, Manusmriti and the various other law digests. And that you have this modern sense of equality before the law. So the law is very important. The Constitution is important. We may not be anywhere close to constitutional morality, but he upheld all of those values. But at the same time, he was constantly sort of plagued by doubt that law may be necessary, but is it sufficient? So when he was appearing before all these British political commissions, which offered more and more political opportunities for Indians at that time to be part of legislatures and so on. So one of the people that was examining him as a witness asked him, "So do you think that this will change the lives of Dalits, of the untouchables as you call them, that giving them more seats in the assembly, will that make a difference?" He says very poignantly, he says, "You cannot make a man love his neighbor through an act of legislature." I mean, this is a very powerful statement, because what he's saying is caste thrives on hatred. Caste thrives on separation and otherness. I can't ask you to love me through an act of law, but at least I can create a situation where if someone expresses hatred actively against me, he or she can be punished. So that's the way the law was framed by him. And I think there's a lot of value to that. And I think feminist engagement with the law has also been along those lines to some extent, that the law allowed you to talk about certain things in public. See, to talk about sexual violence otherwise is very traumatic, as all of us know who've experienced any form of abuse. How do you even find the right words for it? The law gives you a kind of, let's say, register to talk about it, in terms of crime and punishment. So the law allows you a certain way of talking. Things get icky with the law also, like this whole business about whether there was semen or not semen and all of that, right? But that's something that you then sort of have to fight with and do stuff with and so on. Yes, our campaigns have been largely of legal nature, but I think if you are an active movement, if you're an active political group, you also continue to do things alongside your legal campaigns. So you, in the heyday of the fight against sexual violence in the 90s, people were not just going to the police stations or to the law courts, they were also reading and writing and publishing and saying stuff about society. What kind of a society produces this kind of a culture? And I think there was a kind of an interaction between the two. Specific solutions through the law, a larger debate around what you call structural issues. But is that enough? I'm not sure. So, because structures are also material, right? They have to do with what people have, what they don't have, whether you're of this community or that community, whether you're a Dalit or a non-Dalit. These things matter a great deal, which is why I think somewhere many of our struggles as feminists are necessarily got to be multiple. That we need to sort of not just fight in the legal domain as feminists wherever we are, but also align ourselves with some of these struggles in whatever manner makes us feel that this is something that I'm invested in, not because it's politically correct, not because that's the hip thing to do or anything, but I really think I have to do this, even though I may not fit in, I may not really feel comfortable with everything that's going on. I think that's important because that's also a lesson in humility. I remember during the heyday of, well, it's a very unpleasant history, but when the Babri Masjid was destroyed in 2000, in 1990s, there were protests across India, there were lots of stuff, and there was communal violence, there were protests against communal violence, and some of us, feminists, found ourselves sitting next to people from Muslim communities who hated us, who said, you're constantly talking about gender issues, you're constantly inciting Muslim women to do stuff. But then at that time, we were all comrades in struggle. They also sort of decided that these are not our enemies. We also decided it's very foolish to sit and sort of constantly talk about ways in which some of these men reacted. And we did stay together in a certain way. There's unease, there's discomfort, but that's the way it is. Likewise with Dalit groups, that we do stay and fight, though we are constantly sort of very embarrassed by our entitled position. We're not quite sure what to do with it. In our own personal lives, we're not able to cross certain hurdles. But that's the nature of the struggle, right? You keep pushing your, limits, and let's face it, politics is a wager. You do it in the belief that, yes, I'm doing this at this moment, this is what I believe in. If it hits you back on your face, you can go and heal, or you can retire hurt for some time. But it is a wager. You can't have all the answers before you start doing stuff.
A follow-up question to that, which is also like sort of
Louder.
A follow-up question to that, which is also like sort of a directive question. Do you think capital punishment against crimes like these is a long-term resolutionary answer?
No, resolutely no. I don't think the taking of life by the state or by anyone in any form is an answer to anything. I do sincerely believe in non-violence. I don't think an act of violence by the state can be condoned in any manner whatsoever. People fight, people kill each other. There are crimes of passion, crimes of anger, resistance. Regrettable, but those are not completely deliberated upon and planned, and that's not murder. Human beings will hurt each other for lots of legitimate reasons also. That's a very different set of arguments. But capital punishment, no. The state has no right to deprive anyone of life. It does not have the right over life and death.
Afshana.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
You just talked about like being heard. So do you think that women will be heard unless and until there will be an equal representation of women in the political sphere, especially with reference to the Women Reservation Bill reserving 33% of seats in Lok Sabha and the National Assembly?
I didn't hear the last part. Your voice dropped.
Oh, so
I heard
especially,
it till will women be heard? Yes, Women's Reservation Bill. After that,
especially with reference to like reserving 33% of seats in Lok Sabha and the state assembly. Yeah. And when that will be achieved, I don't know.
See, we have to we'll always struggle to be heard and struggle to be believed. You will be heard, but you may not be believed. This is what every lawyer conducting a sexual assault case knows. Forget the case. You go tell somebody that someone pinched my bottom on the street, people are going to say, you must have done something. You were stupid. Why did you go down that alley? So it's not simply that. So I think to be heard and believed is a struggle, and we'll have to continue to do that. Whether we'll be granted a position in parliament, see, I don't think they will fight. It's all right. After all, 33% has been conceded at the municipal panchayat levels. And it's a matter of time before it will be conceded in parliament either. But I think for us, the question is, what do we do then later on? Right? And there's already an internal debate to that when people say, who's going to then be in parliament? Is it going to be brothers and sisters of the netas who are already there? Or are we going to have a more representative set of people in parliament who represent the diversity of women that are part of this country? And people have been talking about reservation within the 33% also for minority women, for Dalits, for OBCs, and so on. So it's a complicated question. And we need to keep that complication in focus and understand that democracy in the Indian context necessarily involves reservation. It cannot be thought outside of it. So that's one thing. But also, as women, if we want to be represented in parliament, we should also work at a politics of creating representatives, right? Who are the women that we want to represent us? In many places, after the Panchayat Acts were passed, in the 73rd and 74th Amendments were passed, you had women's groups doing huge amounts of knowledge building and training amongst potential candidates. And even after they were elected, they did a lot of work with Panchayat women presidents, councillors, trying to support them in their work, trying to sort of ask them what their concerns were. So I think as feminists, our work doesn't stop with saying that we want to be there, or that we should be represented, but that we actually build a feminist political culture also. And that's a lot of work. And once we do that, then when and if they pass this bill, we'll be in a position to use it. Otherwise, what will happen is you'll have a repetition of the Neta culture. You'll have sisters and wives. The only hope is the sisters and wives rebel against their families, and some of them do. So there's that.
Thank you so much.
There is an anonymous question I'll just read out.
Yeah.
Why do the cases on the fringes, both geographically and socially, never make the news unless something scandalous happens? Are there variables that inform the cases that are able to make it to the mainstream? How can that get addressed? How will feminists address the cases of this variety, or how will they support those people whose voices go unheard?
Thank you. That's a good question. What gets reported in the media is a complex question. One can look at it in terms of specific examples to understand perhaps how something becomes national, so to speak. I'm not going to take the Hathras case because these are very strange times. And we run into all kinds of issues if you only look at the present. Let's take Nirbhaya. What made the Nirbhaya case the focus of a reform committee and amendments in the rape law? It had consequences because that case was heard widely in the media. Why did that happen? A, it happened in a capital city. B, it was a very poignant story that a young woman coming to the city in search of an education and to better her life found this terrible thing happening to her. 3, she herself, till she was alive, was completely resolved to find justice. She spoke as much as she can. She was willing to sort of be there for her interlocutors. And the way the students and the population of Delhi city that cared about this came out on the streets. If it hadn't happened in Delhi, if it had happened in, say, Nagpur, would it have made the news? I'm not so sure. There's a way in which media attention is focused on the metros, focused on the capital city, and the nation is identified with whatever emerges in the capital, whatever emerges in the English media, whatever is deemed of importance through these various means. Now, I wouldn't say, therefore, that whatever happens in Nagpur or Chennai or Kumbakonam or Coimbatore is on the fringes. No, I think for those of us who live in these geographies, it is an event of acute importance. Those of us who are invested in these issues continue to face up to them, fight for justice, be part of movements that fight for justice, do what we can to keep alive the spirit of public conscience in some of these cases. They don't make it to the mainstream media, fine. That's one thing. But I think I would like us to keep in mind, to go back to what I spoke earlier, is that how do we as people invested in certain issues not see things in terms of mainstream and fringe, but that we think that any of these issues, whenever they happen, ought to be seen in a connected kind of way. So I don't think Hathras is a Dalit issue that happened in Hathras, but I can also connect it to what happened to that little girl in Kashmir last year. I can also connect it to Keralanji. I can also connect it to the Jessica Lal case. How do I make those connections? At what level do I make those connections? Either at the level of jurisprudence, at the level of the law, at the level of empathy. I do feel there's a lot of suffering in all these cases. Or I feel that this is something that helps me understand this better. And in that light, let me understand everything else. If Hathras can only be better understood through Keralanji, then that becomes something I would like to foreground. And then I make all my connections on that basis. So rather than think in terms of mainstream and fringe, let's think of interconnections. Let's think of setting up conversations between different kinds of events, of different kinds of resistance movements, and also to retreat and learn and to stay quiet sometimes and speak. I think all these are also things you learn when you engage with the politics of connections.
Gayatri?
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the class, first of all. I had two questions. My first question is there is like this trend in Kerala where I come from. If an issue, say the suicide of women or something like a woman being molested, there is this trend of asking or questioning feminists, especially after 2018, when in film actress she questioned or pointed out misogyny in a popular Malayalam movie. So after that, that's like a question of what about Ray, and like why didn't you do this, or why didn't feminists do for certain case, kind of questions that come every single day. And men kind of give this an explanation, the fact that women did not do anything for XYZ cases, as an excuse for not supporting XYZ women's movements or women fighting for something. So how do we, like, and when someone even asks me, because I identify as a feminist, like I sometimes do not have an answer to how to answer it, but what I tell myself is that it is because we try to because sometimes there is no point in propagating a suicide or a tragedy, but rather what we can do is to make a change, to be heard, because in certain cases the culprit is caught and then there is nothing to do about it. The only thing that we can actually do is create awareness about things that are not actually heard and things that need a change. Is that the right way of looking at it, or if not, what can we how to look at such questions?
See, such questions have always been there throughout the history of the women's movements. Why didn't you do this? Why did you stay silent? Why didn't you take note of this? That's going to be part of how society at large responds to something it doesn't really wish to countenance, right? I think it's very uneasy with what has taken place. It also feels that it's somewhere an indictment of society. See, when people get defensive, you know that they also feel partially guilty. Defensiveness is also an admission of guilt at some level. And in order to deal with that guilt, they must confront the issue at hand. That if sexual violence has happened, or harassment or abuse or something has happened, somewhere when you say, in this case you protested, but not in that case, what are you then saying? You're basically saying that I don't want to listen to you because in this case I feel implicated. Whereas in that other case, perhaps it had nothing to do with me. Why do you feel implicated? Maybe this person is from that region, it's from that community, is a friend of this person, many number of reasons why people say these things. But in a more social and a wider historical sense, it's also the refusal to countenance something for which you feel partially, inchoately responsible, but we don't want to accept that responsibility, to own up to that responsibility. Then the flip side of that is sometimes we also don't always have the energy or the time or the inclination to comment on everything that happens. That's also there. I mean, every single crime does not elicit a response from us. Sometimes we respond from within our own spaces. It's happened in my town, I do something. Or it's happened in a place where there's a social movement, they bring it to my attention, I respond. So I don't think this one should measure what somebody says on the basis of their irritated response, but also tell ourselves that look, I'm not there everywhere all the time. I can do some things, I can do some things now, but whatever I do, let me do that fitfully, consistently, systematically, and see it through. So I think rather than build one index of crimes that I will respond to, and not even take it seriously when they say such things, I think one of the things one needs to really learn as a feminist is a politics of non-cooperation. Just don't respond. You don't have to engage with everything that comes your way. If it is not consequential, if it doesn't affect what you're going to be doing in any one instance, why waste airtime and your hardware in trying to accommodate that? Because I think as we are finite, there are only that many of us. We are nowhere near a majority, and we need to conserve our energies and fight intelligently, systematically. So that's what I would actually say. And don't, I think there's just too much noise around issues these days. And part of it is because of the way things have no duration. Everything is now, 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 now. You need duration. You need time. You need to think, you know. And the pressure of people crowding in on us is what we can't take. And maybe we should detach ourselves from such situations and choose our battles, choose our engagement with social media in a creative and useful way.
I had one more question, if I may.
Perhaps later, Gayatri, we have a couple lined up. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Rashi had one anonymous question.
No, I had a question to ask you. So, you were talking about building collective knowledge, and it got me thinking about how we study different disciplines in school and colleges. And of course, the works that women's studies and gender studies departments that they have done over the years is extremely significant and important. But do you think it sort of absolves other departments from making gender a part of their discipline? For example, there's a complete erasure of gender from fields like economics, for example. And do you think, in some senses, having separate departments consolidates separateness instead of overcoming it?
That's a risk that we always sort of, let's say, what shall we say? We took on board when we all fought for women's studies. It's a difficult question to answer. One, whether it was better to have fought for a dispersion of gender concerns in various knowledge contexts, or to build feminist knowledge and then hope that people would go from there to do other things. I think we settled for the second option because if we don't build feminist knowledge, nobody is going to. That's the other thing. Feminists alone have an investment in building feminist knowledges. So I think the choice to do women's studies and gender studies emerged from that position. Now, yes, in an organizational and institutional sense, everybody felt absolved. That, oh, that's women's studies, you go and do it. I mean, that happens even with practice. Every time, to go back to the previous question, what she was asking, why didn't you do this? So every time a sexual crime takes place, why weren't you women's groups there? Why is it not your responsibility? A crime is a crime, after all. Hurt is hurt, suffering is suffering. So there's a way in which I think everybody just breathes a sigh of relief when we decide to do things on our own because, oh gosh, these women are all, now let them do it. We don't have to think about this. They do feel very absolved. And I do think it's a particularly complete sort of abdication of social responsibility. But there's a long history to that. They take on board feminist concerns in the kind of expansive, energetic, imaginative way when there's a broad collective people's movement. And it is impossible to ignore what women are saying, whether it's the nationalist struggle, a communist movement, an anti-caste struggle. But once the moment of struggle sort of dissipates and then it's back to real life and you have to build things, then women get last priority. And that's something that we are constantly fighting with and fighting against. And I suppose it's a battle that will never end because finally, let's face it, who is invested in feminism? Those who want to be feminists. And it's not every woman, it's not every gender non-normative person. It's a politics that we choose. And we are a small group at the end of the day. Because what we are asking for is very fundamental, right? We want to change life from the intimate sphere to the social sphere. So most people are comfortable with the second. What about the intimate sphere? Restructuring lives there is always a huge risk for most people. And that becomes difficult for feminism. That is a very important core as well. So,
Anish?
Thank you for this lecture. It was really insightful. Is this?
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for the lecture. It was really insightful. And this is from the Tamil Nadu context. We know the legacy of like the DMK, like Dravida Kazhagam, the anti-caste, the self-respect movement and all that. My question is with regards to space and to the caste system itself. Because in Tamil Nadu, there's a particular unique culture surrounding caste itself. For example, our films, if you notice, they reiterate caste through and control over the female body through the principle of valor, pride, and all that. So my question is, when in the process of the caste movement, that is the anti-caste movement, do you think that the lower caste woman's predicament is sometimes muddled and forgotten? And if so, does the mainstream feminist movement find it difficult to make space for the so-called Dalit women? For example, Kiruba Munuswamy, the Supreme Court advocate from Tamil Nadu, she recently said that there is no space for Dalit women within the feminist movement at all. Do you think she's justified in saying that? Because you have other examples, like when the Kakus documentary was made, the maker literally had to flee states. She had to run from her own state because people were giving her death threats. So I know it's a very, very mosaic question. So
there are two parts to your question. One is a historical part. What happened with the anti-caste movements and how did they frame gender concerns, especially of women from subaltern communities. A very long history to how the women's question disappeared from Tamil Nadu, from the kind of radical expressions it had in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It disappeared from the Dravidian movement's own agenda for various reasons, largely because while the Dravidian movement brought into public life and into democratic politics a very wide range of Bahujan communities and some Dalit activists, by that same token, it disappeared women because it constructed the political community as a fraternal male community largely. The thing that you pointed to, valor, and we are blood brothers, though we are not from the same mother. A rhetoric of fictive kinship, male kinship, that constituted this extremely adversarial and extremely creative movement as a male movement, nevertheless, in which women did not really have a huge role to play, except as mothers of the nation, of the Dravidian nation, the Tamil nation. So that's one thing. So what it compromised on was the very acute critique of chastity, beauty, normative marriage, of women's rights to reproduction. All of these sort of disappeared from the movement's agenda. This is a very short, sort of crude version of why gender question disappeared. Now, women from within Periyar's own movement, they existed within a subculture where some things were possible, but that never sort of percolated into the wider culture. So that's the other thing. But that subculture is quite fascinating. If one does a, say, an ethnographic study of Dravidar Kazhum families, you will see that they did sustain a sort of gender equality in their personal lives and in their public work as well. We are not talking about the leadership or of official statements, but the ones that work in different levels in different parts of the state and so on. So that's the history part. Now, Dalit women saying that they are not part of the mainstream movement. If Kripa has experienced discrimination, she has every right to say that. But I don't know if it explains everything about the feminist movement, especially in a place like Tamil Nadu. If you look at the reading that I've assigned to Fatima Bernard, she's been active and a very, very vocal part of the feminist movements in Tamil Nadu and in the All India level right from the 1970s. In fact, every history of the Indian feminist movement mentions her group and her work and everything because she's been present in those spaces. Likewise, Ruth Manorama has been present, and they've been part of these larger feminist networks. They've had an agonistic relationship, they've had a contradictory and fighting relationship, but nevertheless, it's a relationship. And I think I'm just naming some names, but there are women Dalit activists in different parts of rural small town Tamil Nadu who've been very active and linked to wider feminist networks. And I think that's a history that we know very little about, and we need to perhaps understand the details of that history in greater measure, in all its granular details. And I also think we may be doing a disservice to Dalit women if we say that they've never been part of these movements, because they have been extremely active and in the forefront right from the beginning, in an all India level also. If you read Gail Lomwet's account of the women's movement, she sort of indexes the emergence of Dalit women's groups in the 1970s, who were in conversations with other groups, who parted ways on some issues, who came together for some issues. So I think it's a very rich relationship held together by anger, discontent, fighting, but it's nevertheless a relationship. So I think that's something that we need to also keep on board. I don't think it's that simple a matter to say that the mainstream movement ignored people or it kept out people. And Divya's film actually ran very well in several cities. And I don't think that hounding was of a nature that made it impossible for the film to be screened. A play based on this on the film also ran to wide success. So I think she faced a certain amount of difficulty because it involved a certain court case that turned very unpleasant. And also, it's not an index of how these things are received or not received in Tamil Nadu. And I don't think that Tamil Nadu works exactly like some other states. It's a very complicated thing. The Dalit question is both taken in and not taken in. It's accepted and not accepted. It's a far more slippery terrain than we think it is. And I think people have tried to use that slippery terrain in ways that would keep the Dalit question alive. If you see someone like Tirumavalavan, he has straddled so many different political identities because he wants to keep that question alive in and through these spaces. He's very aware of their slippery nature. But at the same time, he's also equally aware that this is a terrain on which he cannot afford to just be an outsider and keep indulging in a politics of critique alone. Because it's a very hard one space to be heard, to be actually called to mainstream television and be made to talk when you don't have that kind of political cloud in electoral politics. To give Mayawati space is different because she does have that cloud. She does have the numbers. To give Paswan that space is different, but Tirumavalavan cannot. He will only get those 4 MLA seats. But today, in spite of that electoral limitation, he is the tallest Dalit leader in the country, one of the tallest leaders, especially in Tamil Nadu. And I think that is also because there's a way in which Dalits, politically active Dalits, feminists, have all sort of worked with the mainstream in creative ways, and the mainstream has also accommodated them in some ways. And contrarian movements in the state have aligned with Dalits in any number of occasions also. This is not to say that there is no difficulty, there's no contradiction, there's no tension, but it's also a relationship that is present. It is not a relationship that's dead or is inactive. And I think there's also a difference in attending to the granular details of vernacular politics from representing it in English. Like I was saying with the feminist movement also, when you started saying some things by pulling them together, you lost out on the local. You lost out on all those histories that made that understanding possible. So I think there are lots of ways in which we may want to reclaim the richness of the Dalit traditions rather than see it only in terms of exclusion. Exclusion is a fact, but it's not the only fact.
Ma'am, there are some 4-5 questions. So we have some 10, 15 more minutes. So sure. I would request you to time your responses accordingly. Yeah. Okay, so
you're reading them? Are these questions on chat?
I have one, but there are some people who want to ask. Ma'am, you can go first.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for the lecture. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. So, you mentioned non-violence in response to like the capital punishment question, and I do not think capital punishment is like any sort of solution. But in the sense of like talking about non-violence in protesting, I just wanted to like bring up a counterpoint and see, I mean, like how I could think through that. So for where I come from, I feel like raising the issue of non-violence in the face of protest is often a way of like putting down oppressed groups when they actually come forward to protest. Like in the George Floyd protests, it was all about it became all about like looting at one point. It was just like Black communities are on the street and they're damaging property and they're looting. So it kind of like borders on telling communities how to protest and how to express their anger. And there's also the sense of like with decades of oppression behind a community's marginalization, is it like the state's monopoly on violence? Is the state the only power in society that's allowed to manifest violence on like communities, and then the communities just have to sit with it and be non-violent in the face of it? So that's just like where I come from, but I wanted to think through that and see where this discussion could go further and how I could read up more and arrive at some sort of consensus with that.
Right. See, there is a politics of militancy. As I said, there is a way in which one cannot take a decision on the rightness of certain struggles which resort to violence or the wrongness, because there are situations where the structure and the contradiction is of such a kind that people fight back and they resist, where violence is a part of that resistance. Well, that's a certain kind of a politics. I may not favor that politics personally, but it's a politics, I think, which is historical, which has had a long sort of presence in the subcontinent and in the world and so on. And one needs to understand that and see it as a part of the legitimate politics of resistance. That's one thing. The second thing is where caste and race are concerned. There have always been very diverse opinions on how do you fight both caste and race. So the whole contradiction between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was precisely that. And both are extremely valid positions. How do you choose which one is far more effective, which one is less effective? Depends on so many other constraints and limitations and so many other possibilities. And in the United States, African Americans have sort of chosen things that are in between, chosen to stay with Martin Luther King Jr.'s kind of politics, adopted Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X's sort of position in some cases. So much has been said on both sides. In the Indian context, anti-caste movements have been resolutely non-violent. That's something we need to keep in mind. Whether it's Periyar, whether it's Phule, whether it's Ambedkar. Ambedkar wrote in a very complex way about violence. He said, I choose non-violent ways of protesting because I don't think caste is a reality that can be destroyed through violence. It's a notion, it's an attitude. It's a monster that will keep emerging even if you think you've solved certain other kinds of problems, like say distributive justice or political equality. You know? So for him, it was an idea, it was belief, it was what he called mental habitude, and one cannot engage with that only through violence. On the other hand, he said, if there is a question of sort of punishing those that are in the wrong, of punitive acts that a state has to follow in order to set right a certain wrong, then that is something that the state will necessarily have to carry through. He didn't endorse capital punishment, of course, but he basically wasn't against punitive action against wrongdoing from the part of the state. Now, the action of militants, those who sort of took up arms to fight a certain cause, he was very careful in pointing out that there are circumstances in which that becomes necessary, but there's no need to sort of make a political principle out of it. Of that he was very clear. There was a very nice, interesting essay that was translated and put on sanati.org on Ambedkar on violence and non-violence. You may want to go back and read that. That's a very interesting position. And Dalits have, of course, done different things. They have been part of Ambedkarite movements. They've been part of the armed left. They've been part of Gandhian struggles. They've been part of movements that are ideologically slanted. So clearly, like in the United States, people have taken to various positions. The Ambedkarite position is resolutely one of non-violence, with the understanding that violence is not something to be treated as a moral issue or as something that is to be constantly frowned upon and put down to, the way lower castes behave, so to speak. That he is very clear about. But he himself was not a man who thought, yeah, the word is very strong, annihilation of caste, but he didn't think the annihilation of caste could be secured through annihilation.
Ma'am, would you perhaps want to ask the three questions simultaneously so that you could then respond together to them? Or should we go one by one only?
Okay, so one by one is easier because then let's just have three questions. Let's go one by one.
Okay. Someone wishes to ask, they say, I have been grappling with this thought. I feel there are humongous problems faced by women in villages. People seem to be talking about issues at workplace and urban spheres. Having been in a privileged situation to attend lectures of this sort, listen to people and read books on these issues, it might lead to individual liberation and change in a way of thinking. How does that transform into an agent of action that try and liberate women in villages and other underprivileged areas?
Well, to go back to the person who asked this question about listening and what does one do apart from listening and hearing and so on. I think once one is convinced of a certain way of looking at the world, one might want to act on that understanding and choose an area of action. If you think or some of us think that there are certain parts of the country which needs to really be sort of where some of these issues have to be considered in detail, then choose to go and work there. There's nothing else that can be done. I mean, I think, as I said, gender or transforming women's our lives in terms of our gendered identities, our sexed identities, that requires us to actually make practical decisions to work on practical issues. And any learning that we undergo or take up has to sort of help us deal with those issues in a practical way as well. So for me, the question is very simple. Act. If you feel strongly about something, act in whatever way you think you are most effective, where your skills, talents, abilities, understanding will serve you best. You know, there's no golden rule as to how one might do this. I'm not sure it's also about urban people having to know all of this, and rural people may not sort of be in a position to know this. One of the things we will all learn when we go and work with communities is that everybody knows what is wrong, everybody knows what should be right. It's just that the circumstances and the means at our disposal are often not enough for us to push changes in the directions we wish to. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the rural context also, I think. So open mind, listening, making connections. This is what I again and again keep coming back to. And to understand this work is slow. This work may involve us making mistakes, may mean that we sometimes don't understand the consequences of our privileged positions, but to take responsibility to wager a risk. Otherwise, how do you do politics? Politics is all about taking risks. Yeah.
Thank you. Ankita, you can go.
Hi, ma'am. Thank you so much for your lecture. So I had a very short question. I just wanted to understand, since in the recent past we've been hearing about the violence or the
Sorry, your voice is dropping.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to understand, since the recent past we've been hearing about the exploitation of women, especially in religious spheres, how does one navigate the space of religion and the feminist movement? That is what I wanted.
Women's movement has taken many positions on religion. One is, of course, within the terrain of the law, which is to think through this whole demand for a uniform civil code and reject it and talk of gender justice and so on. That's one area of work. The other has been a lot of work that happens around communal tensions and issues and being part of peace committees, rehabilitation committees, a lot of care labor that women's groups have done across geographies in India. And there have also been some very interesting discussions on the relationship between women, faith, religion, custom, and institutions also. And much of this has happened in different contexts. In the readings that I've assigned you, there's a very fine essay by Gabriela Dietrich on religion. It sort of gives you maps out an entire range of things that women's groups have done, at least in the 80s, on the subject of religion. I think an engagement with religion is very necessary. How we engage with it is not simply to take a position and say this is right, this is wrong, but also to understand the role religion plays in people's lives. Why do some people think the way they do? And if there is a way in which one can talk about religion so that you don't feel that you only have to run to a guru or to some institution, but that you can actually ask your friend that, look, I have this doubt, I have this concern. I can actually go to a civil rights group or a women's group and say some stuff about religion. There's a way in which the hold of these religious institutions will also lessen on people's lives. Because we've all decided that religion is a bad word, that to talk of religion itself is to be unsecular, we've all landed up in a very strange position. And here I think we have something to learn from anti-caste movements, because while they're all resolutely critical of Hinduism, they all engage with Hinduism. Ambedkar fought a battle with the Arya Samaj all his political life, at least in the 30s. And he was very engaged with the Gandhian vision of religion. And finally, he felt that religion was a very important anchor for people to feel united in a sense of community, which is why he converts at the end of his life. Periyar was an atheist, but he knew every bit of scripture. He knew his Ramayana, he knew his New Testament, he knew the Quran, he had read those texts. And he was very respectfully different. While he may say very, very sort of angry things, he also realized that his anger is with the actual way in which religion is transacted in everyday life. He often said, I am not discussing principles, I am discussing practice, and practice is bad. You people are being unpleasant, nasty, you're being unkind to women, you're being unkind to Dalits. So, I think that's one thing. And in today's context, we really need to think a bit about religion, because that's one area where there's so much confusion, so much tension, intergenerational conflict. So let's be responsible and think of what this religious stuff is all about. Why do we know enough about it? Do we know why we are saying things? It's fine to be uneasy and to be an atheist, but let's all be very clear as to why we are these things. And let's not inherit positions. Doesn't mean that it's a tick box, I'm for this, therefore I'll tick it off. We need to engage with it also.
Last question by Rohan.
Professor, I had a question regarding, based on one of the readings which we had on your book Gender, where you speak about the existence of norms which affect different individuals differently based on their social positions. So this is kind of a very curious and a broad question, I feel. If we consider the example of a Dalit man exercising his masculinity by resorting to violence on women in his own family, and the Dalit woman also has to perform a certain sense of femininity which has been imposed by the upper caste women. So I just wanted to know that what are the acts of resistance by these women in the margins and at these intersections, what they take up to question, to challenge the heteropatriarchy.
Right. So you obviously have read the Akatai story in Lokayan, right? That's the story of Akatai. She is a Dalit woman who faces a domestic discord and violence, and also has to deal with the sexual threats at her workplace and all of that. Now, there are different ways in which Dalit women have engaged with their situations, whether it's home or outside, in a historical sense. One is, of course, in terms of being part of collectives that have enabled them to claim their dignity and work and act from a position of strength. Akatai herself becomes part of the BD Workers Union in Nipani. And an early generation of women in Maharashtra were part of Ambedkarite spaces, which gave them a lot of confidence to articulate their concerns. So at the very first conference of the Scheduled Caste Federation, you will see that the women's conference was perhaps the most expansive and the most radical, where they put forth demands ranging from what today we would call protection against sexual harassment, to equal pay and to justice at the workplace, to marriages where they have an equal right of dignity and so on. So it's a very wide range of issues they were able to do it. So being part of collective spaces has been very important. Religion has been very important. In the Tamil Nadu context, I know, for instance, where conversion amongst Dalits there's a long history to that, to Christianity. And being part of certain sorts of religious communities has meant a great deal in trying to find a language to talk about oppression, to actually fight it, to retain a sense of dignity and so on. So there's a very fine book on the Pentecostal movement and Dalits in Chennai slums by a man called Nathaniel Roberts. The name of the book evades me, but if you can just make a note of his name, Nathaniel Roberts. I can't remember the title of the book. So there's a way, that's another way in which they have sort of fought their battles. The third thing is they also look out for each other. Neighborhood support, support from other women around them, sometimes being linked to women's groups. So there are different ways in which they have sought to sort of fight. The other thing is they also have a very distinctive sense of how to balance tensions within the domestic sphere and the larger structural oppression they face outside. There's a great deal of generosity in putting up with domestic tensions, on the understanding that there is something that we face as a community or as a poor, impoverished family that should hold us together. And this is also something that you can read off in the writings of African American women. They also speak about it in fairly similar ways. So I think there's a lot to be learned and grasped from these lives and these accounts. And there's a fair amount of literature that will help us do that also. There's a lot of writing by Dalit women. Urmila Pawar's own account of her life. She faced domestic violence. How did she live with it? So there's a fair amount of writing you might contribute.
That's all for today, Professor.
Okay.
We're done with the questions. Geeta.
Hi, there you are.
I've been here. Thank you so much. I'm not even